Maria Fedorchenko. I'll introduce Intermediate Unit 7 for this year. Our focus will be architectural culture and how we, as actually uniquely positioned insiders, can actually relate to it with design work, with design infrastructures and urban propositions. Just a few words about context of our work. In a way, you've all been surrounded by all the recent stock-taking, numerous exhibitions, events, and even the much-awaited Venice Biennale that, to a critical eye, actually gives us an opportunity to really think hard about where we stand with regards to architectural culture. And following on a long history of kind of struggling, what is architectural work? What defines its product? How do you actually reconcile the extreme diversity of what we produce and how that gets used in a society, in a city, and by architects themselves? It actually asks whether we can actually reduce architecture to a series of infrastructural elements, or do we actually think of it as a series of unique figures that produce unexplodable buildings. But I think for what we will do this year, the most important question will be, is that with all the complexity and subtlety that we've actually developed with expressing how architectural culture is produced, archived, disseminated, there's actually a gap between a much more complex design concepts and building types that respond to that. For example, problems that have been kind of highlighted by absorbing maternity pavilions of Venice Biennale that actually collate the office and archive to emphasize the necessity for the reconsideration of these very distinct places where architecture is made and distinct times in its life cycle as it's produced, disseminated, displayed, sold, killed, disposed of, or immortalized. So the way we will respond to this is by saying that if we could actually try to look at all these different moments and expressions at the same time, and perhaps we can bring them together in a design framework that's quite broad and can accommodate all these differences, then we can develop a series of points of contact and actually force these things to exchange, to force them to create new kinds of spaces and events. And in turn, if that happens, then we'll be able to produce architecture that actually has a very topical response to architectural culture and the built infrastructure that actually lies below it. So what our main briefs will ask you to do is design sites of exchange. We'll think of those things as shared platforms. I'm not going to say it's going to be a building. It's going to be something that develops from fragments and samples of buildings into much more interesting construction that actually brings together different artifacts, different makers, different audiences, and forces that new products and events to emerge. So thinking of, in a kind of a larger picture, what we've been doing for the past few years is actually developing the notion of the cultural processor, meaning we'll be very interested in different processes that happen culturally, spatially, economically, that actually lies below our buildings. And a cultural processor is basically a building that can take a lot of things coming into it from the city, from the discipline, from its users, and give us something that isn't just a sum of its parts, but something qualitatively different, something very new. So a brief manifesto to give you a sense how I propose we work this year is by thinking of what we learn about and the case studies and precedents we analyze as something that is subject to extraction. We can actually pull out these most interesting moments, most interesting elements out of context, and at the same time, immediately re-embedded in context. So we will extract and reconceptualize, extract and reconceptualize, actually reveling in that kind of fine cobweb connections, references, analogies. And we will always see our work as intricately connected. There'll be a lot of little threads kind of running from a project. Sample and synthesize is easy. I mean, we've always worked with elements and systems. We devise a lot of little things and put them into big things, then break it down into small things and work on these two levels. Organize and shake up. As we know, these diagrams and systemic way of thinking can be quite overbearing sometimes. So counteract that, you'll get the best of both worlds. We'll actually systematize and organize the project at crucial points of the year, but we'll also shake things up. Means we'll provoke, pollute, bombard, steal, copy. We'll do a lot of these little things that goes with kind of increasingly popular cool, easy, and light attitudes. Conceptualize and anchor. We'll actually develop conceptual frameworks that are very deeply grounded on formal, spatial kind of elements of architecture, and there'll be special workshops that help you ground your work. Format and stream. Of course, with a brief like this, we can't just be flippant about how we show our work. So we'll be very deliberate about how we package and format it and present it. And also streaming. How do we stream it so that it actually becomes part of the architectural culture? It actually engages with those different flows that we're interested in. So hopefully that will be a good way to go. Let me say a few words about each of the main stages so that you can get a sense of the progress of the year. And also, I'll show quite a lot of images, but they're basically samples of work and some of the atmosphere of our friends and enemies when it comes to precedence. So you could get a sense of what kind of larger field of context you'll actually be operating in this year. You'll start with a couple really quick exercises. They are meant to give you both kind of the fundamentals approaches of the unit, its core techniques, its processes, its assumptions. So it's really important to learn early so you can kind of build upon it and disagree with me and really develop your personal way of working. And it's also important to introduce the idea of working with an element that's part of the larger context and move between different levels of work. The first exercise will be taking a case study of an architectural product. And I mean a product from a book to a drawing, to a pavilion, to a built work. You know how diverse these are. So by taking one and actually using that as a kind of a beginning of our artificial forensics and excavations to start unraveling these threads that connect it to different contexts. If you take, for example, Barcelona Pavilion, immediately you're going to be talking about the Mises' work, the flow of space, the semi-enclosure, the techniques of collage, but also on a kind of a different axis. The remakes, the copies, the reverberations, the visual arts responses to this, the threads start to percolate very quickly. And if you take on the other extreme, a book, SML-Excel, I mean, most of you no longer really remember that moment when the book came out and kind of splash it made for us, both architects and educators. But if you think of the book, then you start to think of it not only embedded in a really interesting stream from kind of urban diagnostics, some of this interesting OMA work that was done in the formative stages, but also the larger book machine that OMA has created, the whole context of exhibiting and publishing architecture, this whole obsession with giant books, everything becomes suddenly really important to talk about. There'll be other cases to choose from that again kind of talk about the unbuilt work, the role of architectural drawings, the cases that, like Serpentine Gallery Pavilion, that actually already recontextualize as traces of previous pavilions. Really interesting works. But what you actually have to do, you construct a map. Different kind of maps could work for that. But I think what's really important is this constant interconnecting of different fields, different strands of context in larger, layered, really kind of complex constructions. What you then do is that you find 2 points, and I say 2 points just to give an interesting introduction. You have 2 points that are actually not quite connected in a color and textual culture, and you design a transfer, where you imagine something that works as both kind of a conceptual device, curatorial device, and Asaf kind of brilliantly suggests that it should be a kind of a battlefield for architecture to fight itself out. So it's actually like a boxing ring for architectures to come and play their differences out, but it's also a physical expression of that. For example, a cinematic stage set, and a series of specific element workshops will be run in conjunction with this exercise. These element workshops will be run by Jasper and Magnus. Magnus is graduated from the AA recently. Jasper is still our AA star student, former Inter 7 student, of course. And what they'll be doing is they'll be helping you as they develop this incredibly ambitious architectogrammatic work. They'll come and really say, okay, now express what you're saying in a very specific architectural element. So there'll be a series of workshops that really force you to come down, anchor down, and express it in architectural form and space. And so these element workshops are really, really important to devise these transfer elements. So at the same time as I'm saying curatorial and spatial. Some students in the past have chose to build these really bizarre cotoscopes that projected layers of context and a kind of a new strata and a creation of new covered imagery. Some created layered galleries that were based on a kind of a controlled apparatus of Tate Modern. We'll be obviously looking at architectural exhibitions at that point and the specific devices that have been used by some of the most interesting curators and self-exhibitors. And we'll go to Venice Biennale, as soon as we're able to get away, to actually, for several reasons. Obviously, as I've mentioned just now, an introduction to architectural culture, for a series of really important questions it forces us to ask with regards to content and framework of displaying architecture, meaning what to show and how to show, and most importantly, why, to what end? What would we gain by showing architecture in a particular format, using a particular device, or pulling on a particular cultural stream? So that would be really important. And you also come back with a kind of a bag of new elements and devices that could be deployed in your project, and will actually create a kind of a critical cross-section of Biennale in a kind of express presentations of a kind of a really fun weekend session. The second exercise will follow up from the first and move you gradually from a scale of an element scale of the building. You'll be asked to analyze a larger precedent, and that could vary from a cultural space where architecture physically enters the space of the museum. It could be a space that actually reorganizes our assumptions about kind of social structures and cultural hierarchies in the building, in Sana's work. And there'll be a lot of other interesting case studies to look at. But the main drive of the exercise is to start to think as those cultural buildings as quite fossilized. We need to first explode them and really think about what other connections can be established, both with the programs inside of it, so that they can start exchange better, but also with the city, with the cultural context of the outside, so these connections can start to flow on the outside. You'll transplant your interface device, you'll start adding additional devices, and you'll start messing with the building as both an ergodiagrammatic framework and a spatial structure. At that point, I'd like to teach you how to analyze and read a building formally. Of course, we can use references to Peter Eisenman in this case, and how do you actually extract a formal order so you actually base your project on that, but also how to analyze diagram and modify the logic of programs. So it's really important for the unit to be able to learn both. Then we have a series of digital sessions where we take the digital models that you create of your ongoing building investigation, and we create a really interesting framework drawings that talks about the buildings as accumulation of these different program systems and relationship between them. And these type of workshop, which continue throughout the year, will be the digital series taught by Gergely Kovac. He is a graduate of AA, won numerous prizes for his work in Diploma 15, including the best drawing, Nicholas Posner Prize for Best Architectural Drawing. Currently works at Heatherwick Studio on a series of really interesting projects. And Gergely brings to the unit really unique ability to kind of be right in between representation and reality, and use representation as an active tool to construct the project. So forget just learning packages or drawing conventions. Done. The important thing is how do you then subvert those drawing conventions and break the rules to actually make your project conceptually much more interesting. Okay. Then, towards the end of term one, we move to our first important brief. The project on the city, the research into the city, and our first provocations set in urban context. Okay, this year we're not going to Russia. Sanctions and everything. We're going to Berlin. And not just because of the incredible cultural life and nightlife and all these things that Inter7 has been very diligently researching in the past years. It's a European city that is utterly contemporary and actually sets the models for a lot of transitional context, east-west cities, old-new cities, formal programmatic cities. Berlin has dealt with a lot of its dramatic histories in a kind of projective way. It has given us a different way to think about how old and new can come together to create something really unexpected and beautiful. It's the city that is constantly doing and undoing itself, building, reconstructing, deconstructing. It's constantly in that kind of cycle of life and death, which is exactly what we're interested in when it comes to architectural projects. And it has managed to turn its really brutal upheavals into opportunities to create a really interesting expressions of all the vibrant kind of creative initiatives that occupy the city at some of its darkest moments and create really incredible spaces. They're really vibrant programmatically. And so there's several reasons, besides obviously having a very good time. We'll have several reasons for going there. One reason would be to look at those kinds of creative clusters and really interesting examples from architecture and art context, from bunkers that actually contain some of the largest contemporary collections of art with actually living quarters of its owners, to the Ellison compound that kind of completely undoes our thinking about creative production. We'll visit a lot of sites that are specifically about architectural culture, from Choban Foundation that's based on architectural drawings to Edis Campus that actually was the exhibition place that made a lot of people like Ram and Zaha really famous before they were famous, and continues to hold really interesting exhibitions. And also Bauhaus Archive that contains a lot of products that came from this really experimental, hugely influential school founded by Walter Gropius, from chairs to buildings, obviously, in terms of scale. The second reason will be to look at Berlin as a kind of huge open-air architectural exhibition that continues the tradition of international exhibition from the 80s, when a lot of these stars, as we know them, and really creative thinkers from discipline of architecture came to Berlin to kind of transplant and test out some of their most important works, from Corbusier to Hayduck to Eisenman, who built their kind of housing transplants, to then continuing that showcase of the really huge highlights of contemporary architecture to kind of sites that deal with culture, memory, history, from Holocaust Memorial and the Jewish Museum that do it really brilliantly, and to the buildings that really find a subtle balance between old and new and keep them together yet distinct. And we'll learn really something important from that kind of scale of architectural work, diagrammatic unit as we are. We really will look at a small scale. But the third and most important reason we're choosing Berlin this year is because we view it as a launch pad for a visionary project for centuries, for decades. And I'm not just saying this century, obviously, we can use Speer or Schinkel and a kind of the drive it creates to the European metropolis. But from some of the works you might know, we will look at how the verticality and the horizontality of the landmark, and perhaps looping of that in Eisenman's interpretation, has become really important when it's situated in Berlin, to how the ground is articulated, scored, cross-mapped, and creates a really important legacy for dealing with figure ground and field and object, to the kind of weird introvert wall cities and islands from Koolhaas and Ungers that really deal with a problem of growth and shrinkage and kind of weird moments of centrifugal development that we would be very interested in. And then at that point, you'll be in anticipation of the trip. So the trip will happen after the bulk of this brief. But in anticipation of the brief, you will be already armed with at least one text, one visionary project, and one micro stream of projects that surrounds that visionary project that deals with a topic such as figure ground or object image. You'll then be in a position to put your first architectural provocations forward. Provocations are very important constructions for us. What do we mean by these? It's graphic packages of your ideas put to kind of its logical extreme to test them. There'll be a segment that I'll be helped by Antoine Vaxilaire, my former student, who actually kind of invented Inter-7 provocation with me. So he'll bring with him that kind of baggage of mixing very different kinds of drawings in really quick, really direct ways of expressing architectural ideas. And his own work on Moscow shopping kind of can be used as a good example, because these fields of context and centrifugal cores that they extract some of the juiciest, funnest stuff from shopping and create a new kind of cultural condenser that in turn figures the void of Moscow, which Antoine finds is the main problem, which is unfigured void. And these pairings of drawing an image created quite quickly, but being very effective at delivering your main architectural idea would be basically what provocations will be made of. Working with the city, I'll just go through quickly a few examples. You were working with mappings of the city. You'll be putting some extreme ideas of displacement. And here Isotta kind of decides that the art and culture should actually leave the city, leaving behind dark fields of residual, and in fact liberating the cultural centers of the city to new program, forming that kind of a dark ring of cultural residue behind it. You'll start to move down in scale towards architecture from the more conceptual drawings that look at how monuments can be streamed in the city, to formations such as nests that can accommodate in and outs of different architectural fragments. And let me just say, another kind of moment of supporting that work would be what we hope to do is the Inter-7 Film Club. We launched it last year, and it was very successful, and I hope it was very useful to our students, is basically giving them an opportunity to look at how the city and architecture has been constructed in film, and how we've dealt with the past and present, inclusion, exclusion. And one of our students enjoyed watching the film so much, his whole project became cinematic. So Maxime actually went from his first provocations in short films to a larger film that combined his conceptual drawings of the city to juxtaposition of the real city and a city of memories, and then takes us on a cinematic journey through portals, towers of archives, streets, and such. So all of that work at the end of term one comes into a catalog. Okay, let me move a bit faster. If you bear with me for 1 minute, I'll go really, really quickly through some of the questions that, although they might sound simple, they actually drive really complex architectural design problems. So what do I mean by life cycle and architecture and how it drives our brief? The architectural life is actually a very interesting thing to unravel. Okay. So where architecture comes from? Is it sourced from the city? Is it sourced from the past? Is it sourced from anticipating the future? And how we actually work in space-time. Where is it made? Is it made in work, study, construction spaces? And do we actually view it as a kind of a creative artifact or as an industrial product? And how we cut across these different platforms for constructing architecture? How does architecture move about? Does it travel? Does it transplant itself in a particular way? And what happens when it arrives? Is it just for display? Where do we put the displayed architecture? Do we put it in a museum? Do we put it in a city? Can we sell architecture or trade it in some way? And if you do it, would you do it in a fair or in a flea market? How do you choose what to keep and what to kill? And if you kill, do you explode, burn, or somehow ostracize a particular building? And after it dies, what's left? A ghost, a memory, a history? Where do you put that? And how do you anchor that history? In a piece or the whole thing? If you start putting these leftovers somewhere, how do you organize it? And how do you deal with the potentially unlimited growth of your collection? And then what makes a kind of a new life from an architectural fragment that's deemed dead or about to die? And then how the cycle repeats again when the old becomes the source of the new. So these questions are interesting. You'll have to choose only one or two to really drive your main brief. And that main brief will be basically based on cutting across at least two, ideally more, but at least two platforms, for example, production, consumption, that allow you to pull on these different source typologies, but never really repeat the typologies that are not meant for architecture, museum, library, and create really interesting hybrid types that create these architectural exchanges. Not doing justice to Asaf's project, I'll just mention it quickly. It was a very prototypical project that drove this brief, and a lot of discussions with Asaf have been really formative. Asaf proposes that we actually should start thinking of our actual projects as an intersection of these different influences and contextual connections, and start to create a building. So taking over a defunct stock exchange in St. Petersburg, Asaf proposes that should be an architectural exchange. And here, I get to use my toy. You start to connect these different platforms: production, consumption, display, trade. In working out the second term brief on program and infrastructure, we'll interconnect them this year. We're not going to view them as separate. And just say a few words. Programmatically, we'll start working in our workshop and seminars, starting with the work of two figures, Rem Koolhaas and Bernard Tschumi, seeing as these main protagonists of program and how they taught us to think of program as generic, specific. Then we'll move to much more contemporary reuses of program. And for some of us, we just need to make sense of all these blocks, lines, dots, line, you know, how do you actually visually articulate program and link it to a conceptual strategy? We'll start experimenting with moving across these different strategies. We're not going to be just learning them. We're going to try to work in between these different concepts and material strategy to devise something else. There'll be some process workshops that allow us to mess with it. Okay, you have a programmatic diagram. You have looked at a different organization, be it a line, a loop, a knot, or some intersection of those things. But how does these loops and lines actually become a site proposal? How does it land? How does it start to affect the site? And for some students, it has become quite a direct relationship between these different platforms and different sectors that define a project and how the site works. So they actually define the different sectors of the site and develop quite detailed plans. But to help us do this, we'll use that second concept, infrastructure. Infrastructure, put very simply, for Inter 7, is something that is a combination of diagrammatic framework and a spatial armature, spatial skeleton. And so we'll use a series of projects to help us do that. But this year, what I propose we do, as opposed to just going to the regular suspects of the kind of modern, late modern work from Team 10 and Archism Super Studio and Japanese metabolism, we'll mix it a bit more with a kind of a postmodern attitude towards structure and system. And here we'll tap into slightly more cultural, linguistic, and layered constructions. Some work will involve copying drawings, colliding different infrastructures on the site. For some students, this work starts to move between a larger infrastructure. For Shira, it's actually a kind of a gradient of all the different programs you can imagine, from prison to museum to shopping mall, but then focusing on a very specific junction, prison highway, and creating a kind of a mobile unit that can negotiate that. And in term two, the work will be anchored by modeled prototype that will move between element and infrastructure. For third years, this is very nicely linked to their TS work on smart elements. So you'll take what you deem a fundamental element, a wall, a platform, an elevator or escalator, and develop into what you think should be a smart element working in your building and creating both kind of structural connectivity, but also environmental effects and optical deception in this particular case. Let me just, how much time do I? To make this section, which is the most important section, term 2 work, if I can clarify just a little bit by running really quickly through 3 sample projects that we made. Jesper Henriksen designed basically a conflation between museum and factory because he was dissatisfied with the superficial conversion of industrial architecture into so-called art clusters, which are kind of transplanted global models. So he wanted to invent a very new model. So we developed a kind of a concept of contextualizer, which takes the art through what we could now see as these kind of platforms, from display to exchange to trading. And then he develops very particular smart elements that conflate precedents and are meant to both deceive the consumer of art and also give the information to the curator, and ultimately assembles this kind of a linear cultural processor that combines on the outer edges kind of a production In the bottom part it's basically preparation, and the main contextualizer, the linear city that runs through its core. Lorenzo's project is unique in that it actually really explains how we approach programs. So Lorenzo gets really interested in fluid and frozen, or kind of rigid and soft understanding of program. And from his very first Urban Provocations, he's kind of interested in juxtaposing the frozen, rigid programmatic structure of the city with a kind of event performance-based fluidity of it. So he creates programmatic scores that don't just learn from what Chumi did or what Rem did. It actually creates an kind of soft transitions between these different understandings of program, while using as an inspiration the site of a church that has been brutally transprogrammed in the past, and so it's perfect for that kind of experiment. He combines programmatic and formal scores, and his final drawings are actually, although they look like Jesper's, they're actually temporal. They're actually temporal unfolding of what happens to the building. And then he is able to track much more specifically how these different programmatic states shift and how they give us a completely kind of escaping fluid understanding of type. Video Pushpanathan is a very beautiful project that actually got us the much coveted RIBA bronze medal. And for the best I think it's best part 1 project in the world. Vidya develops her work precisely with the cycle of deconstruction and reconstruction on a series of sites in Moscow, and then develops a kind of a cloud scaffolding that lands on a bridge that basically straddles all the new cities, and then starts to populate that kind of endless infrastructural grid with a series of point cores, active cores, that start to combine fragments from architecture that's been dead and architecture that's borrowed from the city. And these cores, because they're constantly in the process of reconstructing and deconstructing and mediating between different fragments, actually create very interesting programmatic possibilities. Okay, at the end of term 2 and at the end of the break, you would have worked very, very hard and you would basically have your project. At that point, you'd be tempted to just keep developing it. But I will ask you to stop and take a pause and think about what really needs doing. So I see the main problem is that we basically become really good at analyzing work of others by that point. You'll become really effective at this kind of the critical dissection of work. But now I ask you to apply it to your own project. And don't think that the project is ever finished or the project is a process, but at that point, look at it and very critically choose how do you cut conceptually and what you really choose to develop. So despite our prolific output, we're actually quite a lazy unit. So we have to be very strategic in choosing things we want to work on. Main cuts might be how the building relates to its cultural and urban contexts, how it works specifically, and what particular elements, as crucial examples, help us glimpse architectural reality. Olympia is a great example because she unfolds these cuts and what we call tier transcripts along different scales, both kind of architectural fragments of the double museum anti-museum worlds, the kind of the drift that takes us through an urban infrastructure, and even the endless gradient of her main element, which is the boundary wall and a kind of a thick space that goes from wall to boundary zone to transitional gallery. Other students have managed to collect how the project operates, meta drawing, with a kind of, again, unfolded transcripts that take us through different occupancies, programs, and reconnects all these different samples. For you, the context may be method, history of a profession. How do we learn to copy? So for Asaf, that is the main disciplinary context. On the urban context is the creating of a new city that is tweaking what collage and copy can give us and create a kind of a splintered landmark work. And the elements, again, become smarter over time. Again, a cutting between a larger operation of the site, very, very complex diagrams that Isotta makes, and very zoom-in, up-close simulations of what a dramatic effect those fields of residuals and endless infrastructures of display can actually create. So ultimately, Inter 7 presents itself like this. It's basically a project that comes out of a cloud of knowledge that's being created, and then we stream the highlights for you to enjoy specifically. And over time, this is how we've been showing our work. It's between a kind of a condensed matrices of diagrams, prototypes, the highlights, the best drawings that we make, the books that condense all the density of our research, the kind of a junkyards and depositories of our own dead prototypes and architectures. And this is, I think, something for you to consider if you're interested in a type of unit that gives you an ability to learn and think and research, but also be effective in channeling it into design. It gives you an opportunity to work a little bit like a good intermediate unit would, which is give you a methodological introduction to architecture, but also it has a bit of a diploma attitude in that you need to have a thesis. You have to take a position. You'll love the power of provocation and the beautiful laziness of it, and also you'll learn a lot of techniques, how to make really intricate images. You will learn to move quickly between conceptualization and architecture, and ultimately, hopefully, your project will become thicker as a result. That means it will have a conceptual component, it would have an urban component, it would have an architectural set of elements, and it will have these technical devices that hopefully will cover quite a broad range and prepare you for whatever you would like to undertake after being with us. You can read on my background. I'm basically primarily a theorist, but I have an architectural practice and an urban consultancy, and I'm very excited also to launch a new collaborative platform with my former students, Antoine Baxelaire, Plaque Architecture, which is dedicated to curating architectural provocations. Despite my name being there, I'm not alone. I'm teaching with a lot of amazing consultants and friends that come in a unit, and we have at least 1 to 2 workshops per brief. We have a new technical consultant coming in addition to Damien Rogan, who is the director of structural engineering. We also have Tommaso Franzolini, a new tutor joining us in TS. So hopefully ready for a good year, and come and chat with me in the mixer if you